A perfect uedding, or a peer of ekit maestakeg. Ethan Carter stood at the window of his penthouse suite, gazing at the breathtaking skyline of New York City. The city had been his playground for the past 5 years, a world of power, success, and calculated decisions. And in just 1 week, he would be making the most calculated decision of all, marrying Olivia Hastings. To anyone on the outside, it was the perfect match. Olivia was beautiful, ambitious, and came from a family whose wealth and influence rivaled his own. She was the kind of woman who knew how to move through high society with elegance, who could impress investors at a gala and command attention in a boardroom. But tonight, as Ethan stood in his penthouse, he felt nothing. No excitement, no anticipation, just an overwhelming sense of suffocation. The sound of heels clicking against marble floors broke his thoughts. Olivia had just returned from another wedding planning session. "Ethan," she called, stepping into the living room. "You won't believe the last-minute drama with the floral arrangements. Apparently, the roses I wanted for the reception are suddenly unavailable." She rolled her eyes. "I had to call my mother to get the vendor to fix it. Can you believe that?" Ethan forced a smile. "Sounds exhausting." Olivia sighed dramatically. "Everything about this wedding is exhausting. The guest list, the seating chart, the press coverage. It's like planning a royal event." She sat down beside him, placing a hand on his knee. "But once it's over, we'll finally settle into our lives. No more planning, just us working together to become the ultimate power couple." The phrase power couple sent a strange chill down Ethan's spine. Was that all this marriage was? A strategic move. His phone vibrated on the coffee table, and he absent-mindedly picked it up. A message from his best man, Ryan. "Bachelor party plans finalized. It's gonna be epic, bro. Vegas-level fun." Ethan sighed. The idea of celebrating felt like a chore. Then, another message came through, from Olivia. "Final bridesmaid lineup confirmed. My best friend from childhood, 2 sorority sisters, and, oh, you remember Claire Harper, right? My college roommate." Ethan's fingers tightened around the phone. Claire Harper. He knew that name, not as Olivia's college roommate, but as Emily Harper's younger sister. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Emily Harper, his first love. The girl who had been his world before he became the Ethan Carter people knew today. The girl who had vanished from his life 5 years ago without a word. And now she was coming to his wedding. 5 years ago, a different life. Once, Ethan Carter wasn't a billionaire CEO. He was just a 22-year-old with a dream and a laptop, working out of a tiny Brooklyn apartment, coding day and night. He didn't have luxury suits, high-end parties, or corporate takeovers. What he did have was Emily Harper. She was everything he wasn't. While Ethan obsessed over algorithms and business strategies, Emily lived in the world of colors and creativity. She was an artist. Fearless, passionate, full of life. They had met in college when Ethan was working on his first startup, and Emily was struggling to get recognition for her paintings. Their love had been simple but deep. Late-night takeout, walks through Central Park, her paint-stained hands lacing through his as she talked about dreams of opening an art studio. He had loved her. Until the day she was gone. One moment, they were inseparable. The next, she disappeared. No goodbye. No explanation. Just a text. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." For years, Ethan had buried the heartbreak. He had thrown himself into work, into building a company that made him untouchable. And it worked. He had become the kind of man no one could abandon. The kind of man who didn't need love. But now, Emily was about to step back into his world. And she would be watching him marry another woman. The unexpected reunion. The night before the wedding rehearsal, Ethan found himself alone in his penthouse, staring at his whiskey glass. His mind was a mess. He needed air. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and left. He didn't have a destination. He just walked, letting the city swallow him whole. And then, as if fate had decided to mock him, he saw her. Emily. She was sitting in a small cafe on the corner of Fifth Avenue, the kind of place she had always loved. She looked exactly the same, maybe a little older, but still Emily. The same warm brown eyes, the same way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear while concentrating. Ethan's feet moved before he could stop them. She looked up. For a moment, time froze. Neither of them spoke. The air was thick with unspoken words, unshed tears, years of questions. Then, Emily finally broke the silence. Ethan. His heart clenched. It had been 5 years since he had heard her say his name. And suddenly, all the lies he had told himself, the ones where he had moved on, where he didn't care anymore, shattered. Because standing here, looking at her, he knew the truth. He never stopped loving her, a past that never left. Ethan Carter stood frozen at the entrance of the small cafe, his world narrowing down to a single point, Emily Harbor. For 5 years, he had convinced himself she was a part of his past, a closed chapter, a distant memory. But now, as she looked up at him with those familiar brown eyes, every single memory crashed over him like a tidal wave. Emily, who used to paint with her fingers because she hated the cold feel of a brush. Emily, who once told him that love was about choosing a person every single day. Emily, who had left him without explanation. She was here, sitting alone in a cafe, sketchbook open, as if the world hadn't shifted beneath his feet. Ethan, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. His throat felt tight. Emily. Her eyes flickered with something, shock, maybe even guilt, but she quickly masked it. "You still drink black coffee?" she asked, motioning toward the cup in front of her. He swallowed, stepping closer. "Still don't take sugar." She smiled slightly. Some things never change. But everything had changed. She was no longer the girl who used to curl up beside him in bed, whispering dreams of opening an art studio. And he was no longer the struggling tech entrepreneur trying to make ends meet. He was a man about to get married. She was a woman who had walked away from him. And yet, despite all of that, Ethan couldn't look away. Why now? Why did she have to come back now, on the eve of his wedding to Olivia Hastings, the woman who was supposed to be his perfect match? He finally sat down across from her, the air between them thick with things neither of them were ready to say. "I didn't know you were back in the city," he said. Emily exhaled slowly, placing her pencil down. "I wasn't. Not until a few days ago. For Olivia's wedding." She nodded. "Claire's one of the bridesmaids. I couldn't exactly say no." Ethan studied her. She was dressed simply, jeans, a gray sweater, a few paint stains on her sleeve, so different from the high society life Olivia lived in. He tried to picture Emily at his wedding, sitting among the guests, watching as he exchanged vows with another woman. His stomach twisted. She must have noticed the tension in his face, because she leaned back slightly. "I won't make this uncomfortable, Ethan. I'll be there. I'll smile. And then I'll leave. No complications." No complications. But she had always been his biggest complication. "Why did you leave?" The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Emily stiffened. "Ethan." "No, don't do that," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You disappeared. One day, you were my everything. And the next, you were gone. No warning. No explanation." She looked down at her hands. "It's complicated." That's not an answer. A long silence stretched between them. Emily sighed, rubbing her temple before finally meeting his gaze. "My father was sick." Ethan frowned. "What?" "5 years ago," she said softly. "He was diagnosed with cancer. We didn't have the money for treatment. I was drowning in medical bills, trying to figure out how to keep him alive. And then, your investors came to me." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. "My investors. They told me you had potential," she continued, her voice breaking. That you were on the verge of something great, but that you were too distracted. That a CEO couldn't afford unnecessary attachments. They said if I truly loved you, I'd step aside. Ethan felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. They offered me money, Emily admitted. Enough to help my dad. Enough to make sure you wouldn't look back. He gripped the edge of the table. You took it? No, she exhaled sharply. I was going to, Ethan. I was desperate. But in the end, I couldn't do it. I found another way to pay for his treatments. But by the time I realized I didn't have to leave you, you were already gone. You were already making a name for yourself. You didn't need me anymore. He felt sick. His own investors, the people who had helped shape his career, had also torn apart the only real love he had ever known. Why didn't you come back? He asked, his voice hoarse. Emily hesitated. Because you weren't the same, Ethan. The moment you got your first $1 million deal, I knew I was just part of your past. He ran a hand through his hair, anger and heartbreak warring inside him. That wasn't your decision to make. She flinched but didn't argue. And that's when it hit him. Emily had left because she thought she was doing the right thing, because she had believed the lie his investors told her. And while he had spent 5 years resenting her, she had spent 5 years believing she had done him a favor. His chest felt tight. Your dad, did he? He survived, she said quietly. He's in remission now. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. Good. That's good. Silence. Emily exhaled shakily. I should go. Ethan's heart clenched. Emily. She shook her head. I just wanted you to know the truth. Not that it changes anything. You're getting married, Ethan. You have a life that doesn't include me. And I've made peace with that. But he hadn't. He wanted to tell her that this, her showing up in his life again, had just shattered everything he thought he knew. That marrying Olivia suddenly felt like a betrayal. That the moment he saw Emily, he realized something terrifying. He had never stopped loving her. But before he could say a word, she grabbed her coat and slipped past him. And Ethan Carter, billionaire CEO, tech genius, a man who had built his life on being in control, sat there in stunned silence. Because for the first time in years, he had no idea what to do next. A wedding built on lies. Ethan Carter hadn't slept. He sat in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The ice had melted long ago, but he hadn't touched the drink. His mind was too consumed with thoughts of Emily Harbor. Why now? Why had she come back when he had finally convinced himself that she was gone for good? When he was just days away from walking down the aisle with Olivia Hastings, the woman who was supposed to be his future. But after what Emily had told him, after learning that his own investors had orchestrated their breakup, his carefully structured life felt like it was crumbling from the inside out. He had spent years resenting Emily for leaving. Now he realized she had left for him, to protect his future. And now he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, marrying a woman he didn't love. He ran a hand over his face and exhaled. It was too late to stop it. The wedding was in 2 days. Olivia had spent months planning the perfect event. Their families were already in town. The press was eagerly waiting to cover the union of 2 of the most influential families in the country. Backing out now would destroy everything. His company, his reputation, his entire future. So why did he feel like he was suffocating? A rehearsal dinner. 2 worlds colliding. The next evening, Ethan found himself at the Hastings estate for the rehearsal dinner. The venue was breathtaking. An extravagant ballroom filled with New York's elite. Crystal chandeliers, string quartets, expensive wine flowing freely. Everything about it was perfect. And yet Ethan felt like he was walking into a cage. Ethan, Olivia said, appearing beside him in a floor-length champagne-colored gown. Smile. He forced a grin as photographers snapped pictures of them. Where were you last night? Olivia asked under her breath, her manicured fingers tightening around his arm. He tensed. I was out for a walk. Until 2 in the morning. Is there a problem? She sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I just need you to focus, okay? This wedding is going to be the event of the year. The Hastings and Carter names merging together. It's exactly what both of our families wanted. Exactly what our families wanted. But not what he wanted. Before he could respond, Claire Harper, Emily's younger sister, approached them, beaming. Olivia, everything looks incredible, Claire gushed. Thank you, darling. Olivia smiled. I can't wait for Saturday. Claire turned to Ethan. Ethan, I believe you remember my sister. His entire body locked up. He turned his head slowly, and there she was, Emily. She wore a simple blue dress, nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress high society. But she didn't need to. She was effortless. Her brown eyes met his, and for a moment, the entire ballroom faded away. Ethan. It was unspoken, but he felt it. Olivia's grip on his arm tightened. Emily, I'm so glad you could make it. Emily smiled politely. Wouldn't miss it. Ethan, say hello. Olivia nudged him. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to act normal. Hi, Emily. Hi, she said softly. The tension between them was suffocating. Claire looked between them, her smile faltering slightly. So how's wedding planning going? Are you excited? Olivia beamed. Absolutely. Everything is falling into place perfectly. Emily's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something haunted. Ethan swallowed hard. You should go say hello to my father, Olivia told him, her voice sweet but firm. He hesitated before nodding. I'll be back. He walked away, but he wasn't stupid. Olivia had maneuvered him away from Emily on purpose. She knew. Maybe she didn't know everything, but she knew something. And Olivia Hastings wasn't the type of woman who ignored threats to her perfect life. A Eastolian moment. Ethan barely made it through dinner. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't listening to the conversation around him. His eyes kept drifting to Emily. Every time he looked, he found her already looking at him. It was killing him. After dinner, when the guests began to move to the terrace for drinks, Ethan slipped away. He needed air. He needed to breathe. Stepping out onto the balcony, he loosened his tie, gripping the railing tightly. Ethan. His heart nearly stopped. Emily stood behind him, hesitant. He turned around slowly. Emily. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of everything pressing down on them. Then she sighed. I shouldn't be here. I know. A beat of silence. You're really going through with this? She finally asked. Ethan swallowed hard. Do I have a choice? She looked at him, her eyes searching his. There's always a choice. Was there? His company was tied to this wedding. His reputation, his entire career. And yet, looking at Emily now, standing there under the moonlight, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Something real. His fingers itched to reach for her. But before he could say anything, Olivia's voice called out from the terrace. Ethan. Emily stepped back instantly. Ethan clenched his jaw. I have to go. She nodded. Of course. But as he walked away, he knew. This wasn't over. It had never been over. And in 2 days, he was supposed to stand at an altar and vow to love another woman for the rest of his life. The breaking point. The night before the wedding. Ethan Carter sat in his penthouse, staring at the city lights, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table in front of him. His mind was a battlefield, torn between duty and desire, between the life he had built and the love he had lost. The wedding was in less than 24 hours. Tomorrow, he would stand at the altar, say vows he wasn't sure he meant, and commit himself to a woman he didn't love. His phone buzzed on the table. Olivia. Olivia. Rehearsal was perfect. Just one more night, my love. Then we start forever. Ethan stared at the message, his chest tightening. Forever. He felt like a man on the edge of a cliff, staring down at the waves below, knowing he was about to jump into something he couldn't escape. A second message appeared. Olivia, I have a surprise for you. Be home soon. Home. Was this home? A penthouse filled with expensive furniture, a future designed by investors and social expectations, a marriage built on strategy, not love. His jaw tightened. Before he could think, he grabbed his phone and dialed the only number that mattered. It rang twice before she picked up. Ethan. Emily's voice was soft, uncertain. I need to see you, he said. Silence. Then a sigh. Ethan. We can't. Please. Another pause. Where? Joe's coffee shop. She hesitated before whispering. Okay. 20 minutes. A meeting that shouldn't have happened. Ethan arrived first, stepping into the small, familiar cafe that had once been theirs. The memories hit him immediately. Emily sitting by the window, sketchbook in hand. Emily laughing as she sipped her coffee, paint smudged on her fingers. Emily whispering, I love you, Ethan. I always will. And then she was gone. He sat at their old table, his heart pounding as the bell above the door chimed. Emily stepped in. She looked the same, and yet different. There was something in her eyes, something guarded, like she knew this was a mistake, but had come anyway. She sat across from him. Ethan, what are we doing? He exhaled. I don't know. A humorless laugh escaped her lips. Honest. I'll give you that. He ran a hand through his hair. Emily, do you ever wonder? She frowned. Wonder what? What we could have been, if things had been different. A shadow crossed her face. Every day. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside didn't exist. I'm getting married tomorrow, Ethan said, the words feeling like poison in his throat. Emily nodded. I know. But I don't know if I can do it. Her breath hitched. Ethan, I need you to tell me, he whispered. Tell me you don't feel this, that when you look at me, you don't remember, that what we had was nothing. Her hands trembled. I can't do that. His chest ached. Then what are we doing, Emily? She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. We're breaking the rules. He reached across the table, fingers brushing against hers. Then let's break them. A tear slipped down her cheek. It's too late. It wasn't. He knew it wasn't. But before he could say anything, the bell above the door chimed again. Ethan froze. Emily's face went pale, because standing at the entrance of the cafe, watching them with cold, calculating eyes, was Olivia Hastings. The confrontation. For a moment, no one moved. Olivia's expression was unreadable as she stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor. Emily quickly pulled her hand away from Ethan's. Olivia's voice was dangerously quiet. Tell me this isn't what it looks like. Ethan stood slowly. Olivia, Shut up, she snapped, her mask of composure cracking. She turned to Emily. You. Emily swallowed hard. Olivia, you were just supposed to be a guest at my wedding. But of course, you couldn't stay in your place. Olivia's eyes flashed. You think you can just show up and take what's mine. Emily flinched but held her ground. He was never yours to begin with. Olivia's hand struck across Emily's face, the sound echoing in the cafe. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing Olivia's wrist. Enough. Emily touched her cheek, eyes burning. Olivia's voice trembled with rage. You're choosing her. Ethan's jaw tightened. I never chose you. The words landed like a slap. Olivia's breath hitched. Then, her expression hardened. She stepped back, smoothing her dress as if regaining control. Do you know what you're doing, Ethan? Her voice was quiet, deadly. Yes, he said without hesitation. She nodded slowly. Then be ready for war. She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving behind a storm Ethan wasn't sure he could stop. What now? Ethan turned back to Emily, heart hammering. Her eyes were still filled with shock and pain, her fingers pressing lightly against her cheek where Olivia had hit her. "Emily, I have to go." She turned quickly, grabbing her coat. "Emily, wait." But she was already pushing past him, out into the cold night. Ethan stood there, his entire world crashing down around him. He had done it. He had walked away from his wedding, from the perfect life Olivia had mapped out for him. But as he stood in the empty cafe, watching the door swing shut behind Emily, one question haunted him. Had he already lost the only woman he had ever truly loved? The fallout begins. Ethan Carter stood frozen in the dimly lit cafe, his breath still heavy with adrenaline. The cafe door swung shut behind Emily, leaving him alone with the aftermath of his decision. He had made his choice. He had just walked away from his wedding, from Olivia, from the life carefully constructed around him. And yet, as he looked toward the exit, he realized Emily had walked away too. His heart pounded. He couldn't let her leave. Not again. Without thinking, he rushed outside, scanning the streets for any sign of her. Then he saw her, Emily, walking quickly down the sidewalk, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to protect against the cold, or maybe against him. "Emily," he called, his voice breaking through the night. She froze, but she didn't turn around. Ethan ran to her, stepping in front of her path. "Please," he panted, his breath misting in the cold air. "Just talk to me." Emily's brown eyes were filled with a storm of emotions, pain, confusion, fear. "You don't get to do this," she whispered. "Do what?" "Throw away your entire life for me." His stomach twisted. "Emily, No," she cut him off. "You made this decision in the heat of the moment. You walked away from Olivia because of me. But what happens when the dust settles? When the world turns against you?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "You think I'll regret it?" She swallowed. "Won't you?" His chest tightened. "No, because for the first time in years, I'm making a decision for myself. Not for my investors, not for my family, not for society." His voice softened. "I'm choosing you." Emily's expression crumbled for a second. Her lips parted, her breath hitched, and for the briefest moment, he thought she might actually believe him. Then she shook her head. "This isn't fair," she whispered. Ethan stepped closer. "What isn't?" "You're asking me to risk everything, Ethan. I just got my life back on track. I teach, I paint. I finally stopped looking back." Her voice cracked. "And now you're standing here, throwing your whole world away, and you expect me to just, what? Jump into this with you." He exhaled sharply. "I don't expect anything. I just know that when I looked at you tonight, I felt alive again. And when you walked out that door, it felt like I was losing everything." Emily squeezed her eyes shut. "Ethan, you still love me," he said, softer this time. "Don't you?" She let out a shaky breath. "That's not the question." "Then what is?" She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "The question is, do you love me enough to survive what happens next?" Ethan froze. Before he could ask what she meant, a black SUV screeched to a stop beside them. The door slammed open, and Olivia stepped out. Olivia's wrath. The air froze between them as Olivia took slow, deliberate steps toward them. She was calm. Too calm. And that was what terrified Ethan the most. "Olivia," he started. "Not a word," she said smoothly, her voice as sharp as glass. Her blue eyes flicked to Emily. "Leave." Emily tensed but didn't move. Olivia let out a cold laugh. "You think this is some kind of romantic tragedy? That Ethan can just throw away his empire, his family's legacy, his entire future, all for some starving artist?" Ethan stepped in front of Emily, shielding her. "This isn't your decision." Olivia smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "You have no idea what you've just done, do you?" she asked, tilting her head. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "I walked away." "No," she corrected, stepping closer. You destroyed yourself." She reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. With a few taps, she turned the screen toward him. Ethan's stomach dropped. Because there, plastered across every major news site, were headlines that made his blood turn to ice. Billionaire groom walks out on wedding of the year. Ethan Carter leaves bride at the altar. Hastings family furious corporate disaster. Investors pull out after Carter scandal. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. His entire world was already falling apart. His company, his reputation, everything. "Do you know what happens next?" Olivia asked sweetly. Ethan met her eyes, his jaw tight. "I will personally make sure you lose everything," she continued. "Your investors, gone. Your company, dismantled. Your name, dragged through the mud." She took another step forward. "And her." She gestured toward Emily. "If you think she'll survive this unscathed, you're delusional. Do you know what people will call her? A homewrecker. A gold digger. She'll never sell a single painting in this city again." Ethan's body tensed. "You wouldn't dare." Olivia smirked. "Oh, sweetheart." She reached out, adjusting his collar like she still owned him. "I don't make threats. I make promises." Emily's voice was soft but firm. "Let's go, Ethan." He turned to her, seeing the sadness in her eyes. She knew. She knew Olivia wasn't bluffing. This wasn't just about a broken engagement. It was about war. And Ethan. He had already lost. A choice that changed everything. Emily grabbed his hand, pulling him away. They didn't run. There was no dramatic getaway. They simply walked, leaving Olivia standing beneath the glow of the streetlight, watching them with a cold, victorious smile. But as they turned the corner, Emily whispered, "We can't do this, Ethan." His stomach dropped. "What?" She stopped walking, pulling her hand away from his. "You heard her," Emily said softly. "Your entire world is about to fall apart, and you think we can just be together." "Yes," he said immediately. She shook her head. "Ethan, I can't be the reason you lose everything." His heart pounded. "Emily, I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But that's not enough." His breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes. "I won't survive this war. And neither will you." She stepped backward, and for the second time in his life, Emily Harper walked away from him. Ethan stood there, helpless, watching her disappear into the night. And this time, he had no one to blame but himself. The fall before the fight. The day after the wedding that never happened. The world had turned against Ethan Carter overnight. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. A relentless flood of calls, messages, and headlines. Ethan Carter, Huvenilates, Olivia Hastings at the altar. Billionaire's empire in jeopardy. Carter Tech stocks, TUMNT after wedding scandal. Investors in full panic mode. Olivia Hastings, I was betrayed. I gave him everything. Who is Emily Harper? The woman who destroyed a billionaire wedding. Ethan sat in his penthouse, staring at the screen in numb silence. He had known Olivia would retaliate. But this was war. His board was calling an emergency meeting. His investors were pulling out one by one. His father had left him 10 furious voicemails, demanding to know how he could throw away everything for some art school nobody. And the worst part, Emily was gone. Not just avoiding his calls, completely gone. She had left the city. No social media. No contact. No way to reach her. He had fought for her. He had chosen her. And she had left anyway. Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to push away the aching feeling in his chest. Was she right? Had he ruined himself for nothing? Had he given up everything for someone who didn't want him back? The boardroom ambush. Ethan walked into his company's headquarters, bracing himself for war. The boardroom was full. The atmosphere was tense. At the head of the table, his father, James Carter, stood with a cold, unreadable expression. "Sit," James said. Ethan took his seat, looking around at the men and women who had once trusted him to lead. Now they all looked at him like he was a disgrace. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, the board has concerns. Your personal decisions have directly impacted this company's financial stability." One of the senior members, Mr. Aldridge, sighed. "Investors don't trust a CEO who makes impulsive, reckless choices. Walking out on Olivia Hastings has cost this company millions." Another executive chimed in. "Stock prices are in freefall. Hastings Global has cut all business ties with us." Ethan's fingers curled into fists. "So what do you want?" "My resignation." His father finally spoke. "Yes." The word cut through the air like a bullet. Ethan's heart pounded. "You're serious?" James leaned forward. "You have embarrassed this company. You have ruined your credibility. You have made decisions like a foolish, lovesick boy instead of a businessman." His voice was razor sharp. "You are no longer fit to lead." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "I built this company. I own the patents, the technology. You can't just push me out." James smirked. "Actually, son, we can." A thick folder landed on the table in front of Ethan. Legal documents. Fine print. A carefully constructed coup. They had been planning this, waiting for him to make one wrong move. And he had handed them everything. Ethan looked at the people in the room, his stomach twisting. All these years, he had thought he was in control. But in reality, he had just been playing by their rules. And now, they had just removed their king from the chessboard. Rock bottom. Ethan stumbled out of the boardroom, his mind spinning. He had lost everything. The company, his credibility, his entire future. And worst of all, Emily was still gone. He walked out of the building, barely aware of the paparazzi flashing cameras in his face. "Ethan, do you have a statement? Was Emily Harper worth destroying your career? Are you going to beg Olivia to take you back?" He ignored them, his chest hollow, his mind blank. By the time he reached his penthouse, he felt like a stranger in his own life. The suit, the luxury, the power, none of it mattered anymore. He had spent his whole life building an empire. And now he had nothing. No company, no investors, no Emily, nothing. His phone buzzed. A message. From Emily. "Meet me. The old place. The last chance." Ethan drove across the city like a man on a mission. Joe's coffee shop. The place where everything had started. Where he had fallen in love with her. Where he had lost her. He walked inside, his heart pounding, and then, there she was. Emily sat at their old table, staring down at her coffee, looking just as lost as he felt. He sat across from her. "You left." She sighed. "I had to." Ethan's voice was raw. "Why?" Her eyes filled with emotion. "Because I was afraid." He swallowed hard. "Of what?" Emily exhaled. "Of being your biggest mistake." His heart cracked open. "You're not a mistake." She met his eyes. "Then tell me it was worth it." "Losing everything. Your company, your reputation, your future." Ethan leaned forward. "None of that was ever my future, Emily. It was just a life I convinced myself I needed." She bit her lip. "And now?" He reached for her hand. "Now, I finally see what really matters." A tear slipped down her cheek. Ethan squeezed her fingers. "I would do it all over again, 1,000 times, because at least now I'm free." She exhaled shakily, gripping his hand tighter. "Ethan." And then, she broke. She leaned across the table, pressing her forehead to his, her breath warm against his skin. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. His chest ached. "I never stopped loving you either." She pulled back slightly, searching his face. "So, what do we do now?" Ethan smiled for the first time in weeks. "Now." He laced his fingers with hers. "Now we start over. The right way." She let out a watery laugh. "No investors. No expectations." He kissed her knuckles. Just us. Emily smiled. That sounds perfect. For the first time in his life, Ethan Carter wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't thinking about money, power, or reputation. He was thinking about the future. And for the first time, it actually felt real. Rebuilding from the ashes. 1 month after the wedding that never happened, Ethan Carter had lost everything. His company, his reputation, his name in the corporate world. But for the first time in years, he was finally living. No more staged interviews, no more high society networking events, no more investors dictating every move of his life. He had traded his penthouse for a modest apartment in Brooklyn, traded luxury boardrooms for quiet mornings at Joe's coffee shop, and most importantly, he had traded power for love. Emily was beside him. She had helped him find himself again, just like she always did. And now it was time to rebuild. Olivia's last move. The news cycle had moved on from the Ethan Carter scandal, but Olivia hadn't. She had tried to ruin him. She had destroyed his reputation, taken away his company, and blacklisted him from the corporate world. But somehow he was still standing. That infuriated her. Which is why, when Ethan walked into Joe's coffee shop that morning, he found a legal notice waiting for him. Emily, who had been sketching quietly at their table, looked up at his sudden silence. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan slowly unfolded the letter, and his blood ran cold. Emily grabbed it from his hands, her eyes scanning the words. Her face paled. She looked up at him. "She's suing you." Ethan clenched his jaw. "For breach of contract." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "What contract?" Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temples. "The pre-wedding business contract. Olivia's father had my company sign an agreement that the merger between Hastings Global and Carter Tech would be legally binding upon marriage." Emily's stomach dropped. "And since you didn't marry her, they're claiming I sabotaged a multi-billion-dollar merger and caused irreparable financial damage." Ethan's voice was laced with frustration. "They're demanding compensation. $50 million. Emily's hands shook. "Ethan, you don't have that kind of money anymore." He let out a humorless laugh. "That's the point, Emily. They don't want the money." He met her gaze. "They want to destroy me completely." Silence. Emily gripped his hands. "What are we going to do?" Ethan studied her for a long moment before smirking. "We fight." The return of Ethan Carter. Ethan wasn't the same man he had been before. He wasn't the billionaire CEO who played by the rules. He wasn't the corporate puppet controlled by investors. He wasn't the man who let others dictate his future. This time, he was going to fight back. And he wasn't going to do it alone. Emily was with him. The plan. They spent weeks building a counterattack. While Olivia tried to sue him into nothingness, Ethan did what he did best: create something new. He used the only asset he had left, his patents. His board may have taken Carter Tech, but Ethan had kept the rights to his original innovations. And now, he was using them to start again. He and Emily worked day and night to create a new company, one that didn't cater to billionaire investors or corrupt boardrooms. It was smaller, leaner, and built on the foundation of creativity and passion, a place where technology and art merged together. And this time, Emily was his partner, not just in love, but in everything. The final battle. When the court date for Olivia's lawsuit arrived, the world was watching. Everyone expected Ethan to lose everything. They expected him to cave. Instead, he walked into the courtroom with Emily Harper at his side, a silent message to Olivia that she had already lost the battle she was fighting. When the judge dismissed the lawsuit, ruling that Olivia had no grounds to demand damages for a personal breakup, Ethan turned to his former fiancée and smiled for the first time in months. "You should have known," he told her calmly. "Known what?" Olivia hissed. "That I was never meant to be a Hastings puppet." And with that, Ethan walked out free, leaving Olivia to pick up the pieces of her own failed empire. A new beginning. 6 months later, the small office space in Brooklyn buzzed with energy. Ethan and Emily's startup had taken off, gaining attention for its unique fusion of technology and artistry. The same investors who had once betrayed Ethan were now begging to be part of his new company. But he turned them all down. Because this time, he was doing it on his own terms, and Emily was by his side every step of the way. One evening, as they sat together in their apartment, Emily flipped through a sketchbook filled with ideas for their company's expansion. She glanced at him. "You know, I never thought we'd get here." Ethan smirked. "And yet here we are." She set the sketchbook aside and moved closer to him. "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" he murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Walking away from that wedding. Losing everything. Choosing me." Ethan cupped her face, his voice soft but firm. "I didn't lose anything, Emily." She blinked. He kissed her gently, his lips lingering against hers before whispering, "I gained everything." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with love. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter knew without a doubt. He had made the right choice. Epilogue. A love story rewritten. 1 year later, the gallery was packed. People from all over the city had gathered for the grand opening of Emily Harper's first art exhibit, sponsored by the very company she had helped Ethan build. Ethan stood in the crowd, watching as Emily greeted guests, her face glowing with happiness. A familiar voice spoke beside him. "She looks happy." Ethan turned to see Mark, his old best friend from the corporate world, holding a glass of champagne. "She is," Ethan said simply. Mark smirked. "And you?" Ethan looked at Emily, his partner, his best friend, the love of his life, and smiled. "I've never been happier." Mark chuckled. "Guess you didn't need $1 billion empire to find that, huh?" Ethan took a slow sip of his drink, watching as Emily laughed with a young aspiring artist. "No," he murmured, "just the right person." And as Emily turned to meet his gaze from across the room, her smile just for him, Ethan knew. They had rewritten their love story. And this time, it was built to last. A love worth fighting for. 6 months later, the world had moved on from the Ethan Carter scandal. New York's elite had found another high-profile breakup to gossip about. The business world had shifted its attention to the next rising billionaire. Olivia Hastings had faded into the background, licking her wounds, while Ethan Carter had rebuilt his life from scratch. And for the first time in years, he was at peace. His new company, Carter and Harper Innovations, was thriving, not as a soulless tech empire, but as a creative venture that fused technology with art, design, and storytelling. This time, he wasn't answering to investors or corporate overlords. This time, he was free. And most importantly, Emily was still with him. A new home, a new future. Ethan pulled the car into the driveway of a quaint brownstone in Brooklyn. Their new home. It wasn't a penthouse. It wasn't a mansion. But it was real. Theirs. Emily stepped out, her arms crossed as she took in the house. "I can't believe we're actually moving in together." Ethan grinned, wrapping an arm around her waist. "What, you thought I was going to live in that tiny apartment forever?" She laughed. "No, but I wasn't expecting this." "You deserve this," Ethan murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. He knew what she was thinking. For years, Emily had struggled, living in small, cramped spaces, working long hours as a teacher just to afford her art supplies. Now, she had a home where she could breathe, create, and dream freely. And Ethan had finally found a place where he belonged. The last ghost of the past. That evening, as Ethan unpacked a box labeled Old Life, he found something that made his chest tighten. An envelope, addressed to him. The handwriting. Olivia's. He exhaled, debating whether to throw it away. But something told him to open it. Inside was a single typed letter. "Ethan, I should hate you. But I don't. Not anymore." You humiliated me. You destroyed everything we built. But maybe the truth is, it was never real to begin with. You were never mine. You were just a version of yourself that fit into my world. I see that now. And so, for the first time since our disaster of a wedding, I'm letting go. Not just of my anger, but of you. You're free now. Try not to ruin it. Olivia. Ethan let out a slow breath, folding the letter carefully. For the first time, Olivia was truly gone from his life. No more threats, no more legal battles, no more ghosts of the past, just the future. And for the first time, it was exactly where it should be. 1 year later, the gallery was packed. People from all over the city had gathered for the grand opening of Emily Harper's first art exhibit, sponsored by the very company she and Ethan built together. Ethan stood in the crowd, watching as Emily greeted guests, her face glowing with happiness. At the far end of the room, a group of children excitedly pointed at their paintings on display. The student section, a project Emily had insisted on, dedicated to young artists who didn't have access to fancy art schools. That was who she was, a woman who gave others a chance to shine. And Ethan, he had never been prouder. A familiar voice spoke beside him. She looks happy. Ethan turned to see Mark, his old best friend from his corporate life, holding a glass of champagne. She is, Ethan said simply. Mark smirked. And you? Ethan looked at Emily, his partner, his best friend, the love of his life, and smiled. I've never been happier. Mark chuckled. Guess you didn't need $1 billion empire to find that, huh? Ethan took a slow sip of his drink, watching as Emily laughed with a young aspiring artist. No, he murmured, just the right person. And as Emily turned to meet his gaze from across the room, her smile just for him, Ethan knew. They had rewritten their love story. And this time, it was built to last. Epilogue. The proposal. 1 year later, Ethan Carter had never been the kind of man to follow traditions. But for Emily, he wanted to do this right. So, under the soft glow of the city skyline, on the rooftop of their Brooklyn brownstone, he knelt on one knee. Emily's eyes went wide. Ethan. He took her hand, his heart pounding. Marrying Olivia was a mistake, he admitted. I let the world choose my future for me. He looked up at her, the only person who had ever truly seen him. I don't want the world to choose anymore. He took a breath. I want to choose you. Forever. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Ethan, she whispered. I don't care where we live. I don't care if we stay small, if we never chase the corporate world again. I don't care about money, power, or success. He smiled. I just care about you. A tear slipped down her cheek as she laughed softly. You really mean that? With everything I have. She bit her lip, looking at the ring. Then, with zero hesitation, she tackled him in a hug, knocking him to the ground. Yes, she whispered against his lips. 1,000 times, yes. Ethan laughed, wrapping his arms around her. It wasn't a grand society wedding. It wasn't an arranged merger. It wasn't for the cameras. It was just them. And this time, it was real.